Joining me for this conversation are Lindsay Doyle, a Liberal commentator, Tim Powers is a Conservative commentator, and Kathleen Monk is an NDP commentator. Good to see you all.
Good to see you.
Thanks for coming to talk about this. A big weekend for the NDP. Kathleen, let me start with you. How much trouble is Tom Mulcair in this weekend?
I don't know. Certainly, members have been quite disappointed in the election results, and I think that was clear in the fall and even into the beginning of the winter. But now we're spring, and we've seen a lot of changes in the last couple of weeks. We've seen Tom Mulcair come out and apologize, take responsibility for what happened during the election. He's done a cross-country tour. He stood up to people and said things like, "I believe the survivors," that recent challenge to Mary Heenan, the lawyer for Jian Ghomeshi. And people are really, I think, warming to him generally, but really it's all going to depend on the convention floor. I think that the support for him, in politics, all of us, I'm sure, in our various parties mark supporters, between a 1, someone who's directly supporting you, or a 4, someone who's not supporting you. And I think that, there's a lot of soft support right now for Mr. Mulcair, and it could move depending on how things go Friday, Saturday, Sunday.
Tim, what will you be watching for? And let me give you a little bit of other context. I think it was only about a month ago. There was 800 delegates planning to go out to Edmonton. Now there's 1,500. Does that suggest that the people around Mr. Mulcair are making sure that supporters get out to Edmonton to rally the vote, or does it suggest the opposite, that people who may not want Tom Mulcair are making a point of getting to Edmonton?
Or people might just want to go to Edmonton in April, Peter.
Where it's
don't go.
Or it's going to be a lovely weekend.
And discuss policy.
Yeah. Well, one would hope if you're Mr. Mulcair that his staff and his team and his supporters are trying to get people out there. I think though, and you see it with NDP supporters. I mean, they were, as Kathleen said, disappointed. So were Conservative supporters. When you lose an election where you think you're going to win, you end up being disappointed. Right. And if this is the first meeting afterwards, you want to play an active role in shaping what comes next. I don't know what's going to happen to Tom Mulcair. He's in a different place because the expectations, to be fair to the man, were a lot higher than on any other leader after they went through a review. Because they had gone from second to third, thinking they would go to first. So he's got a higher bar, I think, of evaluation. I honestly don't know what's best for the NDP, and I think that's a question many of the supporters are grappling with. Do they stick with Mr. Mulcair now, as they've done traditionally with other leaders in the past, or do they push him aside and bring somebody else in, but nobody else seems to be ready just yet to fill that particular role?
Lindsay, what do you think?
Tim brings up a really important point, I think, around, yes, Mr. Mulcair is in that position. When you do talk about who's going to replace him, there are no real contenders, and no one's having that conversation. That could very well be out of respect for Mr. Mulcair, but I think that is a really important point here. I can say from experience, we saw in 2011 the Liberals, we had our leader step down immediately. We had an interim leader put in place. So I think that, Mr. Mulcair has not done that yet, which does indicate he absolutely wants to stay. I think, Kathleen brought up some interesting points about what he's been doing lately, being very public. The one thing that I do have to notice is that he wasn't as public in the days following the election. And I think for some members who did fight very hard for an extremely long campaign, who were very devastated by the loss, they probably would have liked to see him out a little bit earlier. But again, he had a challenging time, and that was difficult for the party, so I understand. But it might hurt him when it comes to this weekend.
How important, Kathleen, is that 70% number? People say Tom Mulcair needs to get 70% support, or 70% people who say they don't want a leadership review.
Right.
What if he gets 68.7 or 69.2?
I have never met a political leader who is not obsessed about these leadership reviews. They all obsess with them, even at the greatest heights. Even Jack Layton, who I worked with in the 2009 convention where he was doing very well, in the 2011 election where he just won official opposition status. Every leader is obsessed with the number, right? And so certainly you mentioned 70%. That's the conventional number. That was set largely by Joe Clark, who got high 60s and basically said, that's not good enough. I'm going to resign my seat.
Yeah, in fact, just for the record, Joe Clark got 66.9 and didn't resign, 66.4 and did. He did worse on the other way around. Yeah. Right, the other way around, and still stepped down.
Yeah, so that's where that number comes from, the 70. But in terms of the NDP constitution, it's actually only 50% plus 1. So he only really needs to get a majority
But could
in
he
the
stay
room.
on with 50% plus one?
Well, that's where the question is. Then that's where he and his team and his family need to wrestle with the idea. And that's why, as Tim pointed out, his team around him right now should be working to secure the best result.
Well, and if Mr. Mulcair got 51% or 60%, I don't imagine he stays, because he's got enough fighting to do without the internal fighting. If a leader has something hanging over his or her head that is hanging there because of frustration within the party, that's not to their advantage. And most smart leaders don't want to stay when that's the case, because their energy is going to be wasted dealing with internal fights. And Tom Mulcair doesn't deserve to have to continue to fight, in my view. If he only has 56% of the vote, he can leave gracefully and keep going and do whatever he wants to do next. But I think if he doesn't get 70, even if, he may even raise the bar a little higher himself, as Kathleen says, to 75 or 80.
Yeah.
I don't think he's going to want to squeak over this bar that Rebecca Blakey sort of put out there.
Right.
But one thing that we can look at is the fact that there is still a number of years before the next election. So what happens this weekend doesn't necessarily mean that Mr. Mulcair is going to fight the next election. So there still is time that if he chooses to stay, get the NDP to a midpoint where he says, I've done my job and I'd like to pass the torch on to someone else. This is not the either the end or the beginning for him when it comes to that, because there could very well be a different leader that runs in the next election for the NDP.
Let's talk about that. It's interesting. What torch would he be passing? And I guess that brings us to the question of what is the NDP? What does the NDP want to be? That's going to take place this weekend too, because you can have the conversation about who should lead the party. The question becomes what kind of party and what's the vision of the party that person is leading. So these days you hear a lot of New Democrats talking about the change in the Labour Party in Britain, and Jeremy Corbyn. You talk about Bernie Sanders and the idea is he's pushing far left in the United States, and does that not bring us to a fundamental question for the NDP in this country? Is if they want a big push left, is Tom Mulcair the guy to lead a party to a big push left when he's spent most of his time bringing the party closer to the middle?
Well, I don't know if that's a fair assessment.
Okay.
I would say that if you actually look to the platform of the party in 2015, it was actually one of the most progressive platforms ever. The Fight for 15 was in there for a $15 minimum wage, the Fight for $15 daycare, the Fight for pharmacare, to institute a new national pharmacare program. These things weren't sold well, they weren't communicated effectively. That said, I don't know if you actually looked at the black and white ink in that platform document, you could actually say that that wasn't a socially democratic, progressive platform. But I think that is the characterization of Mr. Mulcair that you've just described, the idea that he's maybe too centrist. It's been something that's been
Well, that's what the
hanging over
Democrats
him.
are saying.
Yeah,
The Democrats who don't like Tom Mulcair are saying he spent, well, not just Tom Mulcair, in fairness to Tom Mulcair. Some in the party have said that about the party over the last 15 or 20 years. It's been more committed to trying to find a mushy middle to power than it has been to the ideas that brought it to where it is today. Tim, what are your thoughts?
Well, I don't know if I model myself after the Brits. Jeremy Corbyn's half-cracked, and the Brits have a long history of half-cracked leaders.
And he's facing a bit of a mutiny in his own party right
exactly.
now.
And the Labour Party has been in tumult ever since Gordon Brown stepped down, even before Tony Blair, so I'm not sure that's analogous. And as for Bernie Sanders, I think he's tapping into a very different vein in the United States than is applicable here. But, I think you're right. The NDP and the Conservatives face this too. Do have to reflect on what it is we want to be going into 2019. And part of the challenge the NDP have, and the Conservatives have it in a different way, is, all right, we were planning to be government. Do we go down that? Because that's a bigger debate in the NDP. Are you the conscience, as Charlie Angus and others say, or do you want to be the governing party? And I think that's not going to be settled this weekend. It'll start to grow in different ways after this weekend.
Can I ask, let's move to, in the same sort of context though, the polls show, Lindsay, that the Trudeau honeymoon may be starting to wane just a little bit, which I think most people would expect to happen. We know lots of Democrats voted Liberal as the change party in the last election. Liberals are now proposing to open up that membership system, I think, to consolidate the people who came over in the last election. They want to make it a free membership system. They want to create a movement more than they want to create a party. What's happening there, and do you think, I'll ask your two colleagues here to respond to that test of membership, but what's the objective here?
So I mean, I think the objective is exactly what happened when we underwent the previous leadership race. So adding what was at the time a supporter class to say to people, you know, if you want to come and have a conversation with us and be involved in the future of our party and the future of who we want to lead our party and into the next election, which obviously gave us Mr. Trudeau, it was a wonderful thing for us to do because at the time our numbers were dwindling. A lot of people didn't want to make the commitment to the Liberal Party. So we said to them, let's give you a chance to come in. And we still had those kind of, I hate to say it, but two tiers of memberships at the time. One, the official membership who could attend policy conventions and vote, and then others who could actually be part of the supporter class. And to now say, let's open it, wide and say everyone, it's a big red tent. We've said that for a long time.
And not even calling it so much a party as much as a movement. Come and join our movement.
I do find that interesting because the people that I've spoken to since the last election, many of them are recent to the party. They've only recently joined and committed to the party, and that's great to hear, especially after an electoral win. So I think, again, allowing even more to join to boost our numbers and to bring us new creative ideas is a great idea.
How do both your parties respond to that, Tim?
Well, I think it's a great thing. I think all political parties should be striving to get more people in, not excluding them, particularly in this day and age when there are more barriers.
Right. But the Conservatives are making it.
The Conservatives kind of arch backwards, to be honest with you. Put it, I think this $25, which can only be paid by check or credit card.
You can only make key decisions if you've been a member for 6 months.
I sort of understand why they do it, but I think it's dumb.
And they also charge people $5 million if you want to, that's the limit for if you want to run for leader. That's at the Conservative Party, which is really out of reach for the average Canadian, as you can imagine. Our party, I think it's a great move by the Liberals, very tactical, very smart move by the Liberals. Also, you'll see some policy resolutions move forward in Edmonton this weekend, actually, that actually point to the same idea, the idea of no more membership fees, inviting people to be a part of the movement. With less and less people being involved in politics, you have to.
Absolutely.
It needs to be accessible to everyone.
Lots to watch this weekend. Thanks for your input today.
Thank you.